The name of this article is Masking Music, a reconsideration of light and shade in Un ballo in maschera. It's by Elizabeth Hudson, who's the director of the Tikoki New Zealand School of Music. In this article, Hudson chimes in on the ongoing critical debate over the thematic use of contrasts in Verdi's Un ballo in maschera. She does this by redirecting the conversation from looking for pairs of opposites in the opera, such as light and dark, comic and tragic, French and Italian, to looking for ways in which the opera dwells on masking and unmasking. The conversation is rather abstract, but clear, though much of the article deals with explaining why other interpretations are wrong in order to explain why hers is correct. She begins with a literature review, explaining what work has been done on the trope of contrasts. She cites Julian Budden, who calls the chiaroscuro of the score the central issue of the drama. She cites Pierluigi Petrobelli, who wrote on this matter in the article that we read called A Fusion of Styles. She cites Harold Powers, who talks about it in his article on the Laughing Chorus. All of these scholars, she writes, had not elaborated on this matter at length, hence the scope of her paper. She says that two factors have caused us to take this contrast trope for granted. The first is that Verdi acknowledges it in his correspondence. Verdi wrote about it, talking about how it would be impossible to change the character of Gustavo because it would make things, quote, false and uninteresting, so that the quality of brilliance and chivalry, that aura of gaiety that pervaded the whole action and which made a fine contrast and was like a light in the darkness surrounding the tragic moments, has vanished, unquote. The second is that it just fits so neatly with the opera in so many places. She tries to debunk the first factor by saying that Verdi is no closer to understanding the plot than any other important critic of this work. She debunks the second one by saying that these correspondences that fit so neatly are simply coincidences. She then goes to explain the trope itself. The trope aims to connect Verdi's statement that the opera has contrasts to occurrences of major versus minor, since there's so much modal interplay. So it associates minor with tragic things and major with comic things. While this does happen several times in the opera, it also doesn't happen several times in the opera. For instance, every time that Riccardo sings about his feelings for Amelia, there is always a touch of minor in it. This goes against the idea that minor always indicates tragedy. For instance, the prelude to Act 2 is in D minor, major, and minor. It's symmetrical. She uses this and other examples to indicate that minor can't be linked with tragedy. So all of these inconsistencies show that there is a problem with the limits of analysis. It's simply too detailed. Any use of contrasts are generally used to create a general aesthetic goal. So once she explains that the trope is incorrect, or at least inconsistent, she starts to set up her interpretation. Her interpretation is that the contrasts are simply a symptom of the greater theme of masking. This theme is not oppositional, but is in fact part of a larger form. She continues to talk about masks, because they're used literally and figuratively in the opera. Literally, masks are worn by almost every person in Act 3. Other than masks, we see several characters using disguises all throughout the work. For instance, in number 2, the courtiers seeking Ulrica decide to dress up in disguises. In number 6, Amelia wears a veil to hide her identity from Renato. Each time either of these masks is removed, there is always a change of mode. For instance, in number 2, when the big secret is revealed about Riccardo's death, the response is in a major chorus. In number 6, when Amelia's veil is removed, the mode shifts from minor to major. This is what starts the laughing chorus. At first, these correspondences between unmasking and mode change would suggest another pair of opposites. And there are correlations. But she explains that these oppositions are not actually oppositions, but are ambiguous. The ambiguity actually relates to a specific form. She derives this form from a book by Peter Brooks entitled Bodywork, Objects of Desire in Modern Narrative. The form begins with an enigma behind a veil. The second part is the unveiling of that enigma, and the third part is finding another enigma behind that veil. She shows how the three parts of this form correspond to the three acts of the work. In Act 1, Ricardo seeks Ulrica to unveil a mystery to him. In Act 2, Amelia unveils her love for Ricardo. In Act 3, her true feelings aren't revealed at all. While this overall association seems somewhat loose, she does apply it to another situation. When in Act 2 Amelia's veil is removed, the reaction is laughter from the conspirators, yet Renato has to add a new veil between him and the conspirators so that they don't know the truth. What is that truth? For him, it's her guilt. Hudson understands this truth to be a little deeper. She claims that the truth is not in fact her guilt, since she isn't really guilty of what she's done, but is in fact his blindness to that truth. One of the points that she makes is that willing blindness is a huge theme in this work. It adds a certain level of depth of character to the women in the work, since they see clearly while the men do not. For instance, Ulrica consistently sees the truth. Also throughout the work, Amelia is consistently aware of both sides of the mask, what people can see and what people cannot see. However, in this opera, men do not possess this same level of awareness. In Act 1, Ricardo accepts the appearance of love while rejecting the danger from the conspirators. Later on, Renato accepts that he has been betrayed but refuses to hear the whole story from Amelia. After all of this, she finally gets around to talking about how the music shows her interpretation. In Act 2, it doesn't happen very much at all. In fact, it usually just sets the surface details of the libretto. In Act 3, the interpretation holds very true for her. For one thing, masks and disguises are everywhere in this act. For instance, Renato has to unmask Oscar to find Ricardo, all while still hiding his plans behind yet another veil. Another example is that Amelia sees through Ricardo's disguise, another example of the woman being able to see both sides of a mask. After the murder, Renato's identity is revealed, and at the very end, Ricardo unveils his truth, which is his respect for him and Amelia's faithfulness. But outside of all this play of masks and veils, the music really shows it through modal contrast within the party music. The party music has a consistent contrasting middle section, which is usually in minor, where the outside two parts are in major. It happens first when it's heard off stage for the first time, and this is when it's in A flat. So it's A flat major, then A flat minor, then A flat major. The second time is when the chorus enters, which is in B flat, major, minor, major. And the third is in Renato and Oscar's exchanges, both of them. These are in E flat. Overall, this seems to resist semantic overlay, according to Hudson. The minor mode is not always associated with masking, and it's not always associated with unmasking. It simply shows the greater form. That is, that there is such an interplay of masking versus unmasking. This interplay is especially evident after Ricardo is stabbed. At this point, the music shifts from minor to major to minor to major. Here he is embracing both light and dark at the same time, what he can see and what he cannot see. So here, major and minor are in a new relationship. She interprets this by saying that what lies behind the surface can be major or minor. It can be light or dark. She concludes by saying that the tragedy that's brought about by unmasking can only be mitigated by further unmasking. She writes that this interpretation, although it relies on the metaphoric relationship between minor and dark, major and light, and acknowledges the ways in which those oppositions work, in the end questions the opposition itself. It wasn't very clear to me how her interpretation particularly questions the idea of opposition, but I think that frustration is part of her point. Trying to find the deeper meaning of this work is frustrating enough, and this article helps to understand why it's so frustrating. Thank you for your time.